the idea of great powers doing a deal at Ukraine's expense has a terrible precedent and is a bad idea. If Trump sits down with Putin, there does exist a danger, a non-trivial chance, that Putin will do a very bad deal, that he'll be suckered, that Trump will do a bad deal, that Putin will sucker him into some kind of bad understanding, and that Trump will try to force it down Ukraine.
Well, let's begin our coverage with Catherine Philp, the Times World Affairs editor, joining us from Kyiv. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Callum.
Good to speak to you. So then, these plans seem to be progressing. Does it seem a certainty at this point that Presidents Trump and Putin will sit down in the same room together next week?
I don't think anything where those two individuals is concerned is ever a certainty, but I would put the odds as good. I think the critical point, however, is the fact that that Zelensky will not be there and is unlikely to be there even in any future meeting. And I think that that is partly a result of this mission undertaken by Steve Witkoff, Trump's golfing buddy turned overburdened envoy, going out to Moscow to meet Putin, putting it out there that they want a meeting with Zelensky, and Putin just dodging that question, so that that when the White House came out with the fact that they wanted that trilateral meeting at some stage after the Trump-Putin meeting, Moscow just turned around and said, oh, well, we had nothing to say about that. For some reason, the Americans brought it up. So I think it's sort of almost irresistible for Trump to do this. It's been a while since he met Putin. He did so in Helsinki some 7 years ago, which was an extraordinary meeting, which I was at. So I think there's a very good chance it will go ahead. Whether it will produce anything of any substance or bring us any closer to peace is another matter entirely.
You were there in Helsinki, Catherine. Are the men that will potentially enter the room together next week, are they the same as they were 7 years ago?
I have to say, I honestly hope not, because one of the most striking things about that meeting was to see President Trump's body language standing next to Putin. He was physically supplicant to him. It was a time when, of course, he was under attack about his own relations with Russia and the idea that there was Russian collusion in the election. And he chose to believe Putin's version of events over those of his own intelligence agencies. And he said so on the world stage. And it was, I think anyone who was there, just to simply see the deference that Donald Trump paid to Putin and Putin's, just absolutely sort of blank smugness as he listened to Trump. So I just hope to goodness that is not the President Trump who turns up to this meeting with Putin, because if it is, then it will go very badly indeed for the course of peace in Ukraine.
God, what an insight. I wonder if there is anything in the build-up to this potential meeting that encourages you then, that Trump is taking a more assertive line. I mean, it's not unthinkable, is it, that if they were to meet next week, that actually there would have been a few days of increased secondary sanctions by then. Perhaps Putin would be under slightly more pressure?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I think we may know more tomorrow. I mean, that is the deadline that Trump has drawn. Now, he doesn't always stick to his own deadlines. So, I think we all in Kyiv here are kind of holding our breath a bit. I think a lot of people think that actually, if something does happen, that we're going to see a very heavy barrage, because that tends to be how Moscow responds to any moves against it. But yeah, secondary sanctions. I mean, we've already seen this move against India. Now, those have not come into effect yet. I think they're sort of a threat against India, and they're in a broader, it's in the broader context of a trade war, because they were framed as tariffs, not sanctions. Although the obviously India buying Russian oil was given as the reason for that. But if there were to be broader secondary sanctions on all countries that buy Russian Russian oil. And if that were to happen tomorrow, the self-declared deadline that Trump himself has put forward, that would be extraordinary and, some reason to think that Trump is serious about getting tougher.
Yeah. Catherine, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. Catherine Philp is the Times World Affairs editor. Well, let's now turn to Alexander Mereshko, chair of the Ukrainian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, and Daniel Fried, former Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs and former coordinator for sanctions policy against Russia, as we wrestle with what this meeting may and may not result in. Alexander and Daniel, welcome both to the programme.
Thank you.
Alexander,
Thank you.
Can I start with you, Alexander, on first of all, where Zelensky is in this conversation? It seems that he is to be excluded from the meeting of Putin and Trump. How does that work?
Well, unfortunately, it's very worrisome because as of now, it looks like two great powers are trying to decide the fate of Ukraine behind our backs. And I think it would be a huge political mistake. And I do hope that if we are talking about serious negotiations, Ukraine should be president. The president of Ukraine should be president. I would even say that the format of negotiations, any kinds of negotiations on the future of Ukraine should include also our European partners, like the UK, Germany and France, at least these countries. And it would create some kind of deterrence against Putin trying to impose his agenda on these negotiations.
Yeah.
And I think there is a danger in this. And that's why I don't think that these bilateral talks between President Trump and Putin will produce anything good for Ukraine.
Well, let's bring Daniel into the conversation and let's make this a conversation between the two of you to try to understand where this could get to, Daniel. Do you have a level of optimism that if Trump and Putin sit in the same room, even without Zelensky, that there could be progress in the interest of Ukraine?
My expectations are under control.
Yeah.
Of course, it's better if the Ukrainians are involved at all stages. That's better. And the idea of great powers doing a deal at Ukraine's expense has a terrible precedent and is a bad idea. If Trump sits down with Putin, there does exist a danger, a non-trivial chance, that Putin will do a very bad deal, that he'll be suckered, that Trump will do a bad deal, that Putin will sucker him into some kind of bad understanding, and that Trump will try to force it down Ukraine. That's not necessarily the case. The outline of a deal could emerge even from a Trump-Putin meeting, which would mark a limited success for Ukraine. That is, a complete ceasefire in place, no recognition formally of Russian illegal occupation of Ukrainian territories, and no limits on Ukraine's ability to defend itself. Ukraine's security in the future has to be provided. So this kind of a solution would not be a just peace. It's only a just peace if Ukrainian territory is restored to Ukraine. But it could be a stable and lasting peace that includes a sovereign, free, independent Ukraine. That would be a strategic success for Ukraine and for Europe. It would be a failure for Putin because his objective is not 4 oblasts or 5 oblasts in Ukraine, but the total conquest of Ukraine. And the Ukrainians, with American and European backing, have stopped this. Yeah. So my expectations are under control. There are dangers, but there is at least a possibility of a decent outcome.
Yeah. Alexander, what do you think?
Well, you see, tomorrow the deadline imposed by President Trump expires. But instead of delivering on his promise to impose secondary sanctions, looks like Trump is not going to follow through, and instead of punishment, Putin is getting his reward, which is summit. And it creates the picture as if Putin is not isolated politically. So I'm very skeptical about, I'm afraid that unfortunately, President Trump and Putin, they can make a deal between themselves and without our participation. This is my strong concern about this. And I see huge danger in this. That's why I believe that any negotiations should continue to follow the principle, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, which has been followed by the previous administration of President Trump. But of course, our goal right now, under the circumstances, is to survive as a state, and to have ceasefire. But what kind of ceasefire? There can be two kinds of them. The first one, which is Putin's idea to create conditions which would allow him to destroy, to subjugate Ukraine only later, which means without reliable security guarantees. But we can agree to ceasefire which would allow us to survive and which would provide us with reliable security guarantees which will deter Putin in reality, not in theory. But I'm skeptical about this outcome, unfortunately.
Let me just bring you both this into the conversation here, because already we may have to reach for the brake pedal on all of this. The New York Post is reporting that President Trump will only meet with Russian President Putin if he also meets with Ukrainian President Zelensky. A White House official is cited telling the New York Post, Putin must meet with Zelensky for the meeting to occur. No location has been set. Daniel, could I ask you what you make of that, first of all? Does that take the principle, the concept of this meeting off the table altogether?
It depends what Putin does. First, Alexander's points are well taken. The danger exists that Putin will agree to a ceasefire only to resume his war against Ukraine at a time of his choosing. So Ukraine's security is critical if a peace is to be lasting. I want to emphasize that point, and I'm in complete agreement on it. I'll be interested to see whether the White House indeed insists that President Zelensky be present at a meeting between Putin and Trump. That would be a good step. It's not clear to me that Trump will accept it. I'm sorry, that Putin will accept it, but it is a strong American position. And frankly, to get Putin to move off of his maximal aims, which includes basically Ukraine's surrender, more pressure is necessary. So I'm also in agreement with Alexander that the U.S. needs to follow through with additional economic pressure on Russia now, not wait, not let Putin drag things out again with more empty promises and empty words. So it's good news if the White House is insisting that Zelensky be present. We'll see what actually happens. As always with the Trump administration, surprise, last-minute shifts, sudden suspense is all part of the game. It's not necessary. It's not helpful to have such confusion, but it is not catastrophic. Things could end up in a decent way.
And just a reaction from you, Alexander, on this report. Do you think President Zelensky, if invited, should be at a meeting with President Trump and President Putin?
Well, of course, I think it's absolute must for President Zelensky to participate in this kind of talks regarding the fate of Ukraine. But I would prefer also to see our European partners, because they help a lot Ukraine. And Ukraine has a status of candidate to join the EU. So it makes a lot of sense to invite also them. And it would make the whole situation safer for Ukraine, because, you know, if we have trilateral negotiations, you never know with President Trump, unfortunately, whether or not he will align with Putin. And that's why we need also participation of our European partners.
Thank you both very much indeed for joining us. There's a really helpful conversation. Alexander Mereshko from Ukraine, the Ukrainian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, and Daniel Fried, former Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs for the US.